Yes.
All right, so we're going to be talking today about how it is that Americans, or British North Americans, decided to finally take up arms against their duly constituted government. And it's interesting how throughout the many years that I've been teaching this class, 24 years now, there have been times when it seemed more and less relevant to be talking about such things. But I think now is a good time to focus on such issues. What would make people feel sufficiently angered or annoyed that they would feel like they would do the ultimate act of breaking away from their duly constituted government? It happens during the Civil War, and it happens during the Revolutionary War. In order to break away from the mother country, it was really imperative that people from many different colonies feel a sense of fellow feeling, a sense of common interest that they perhaps had not felt before. And so we're going to be looking at three different explanations for how this happens: a political explanation, an ideological explanation, and an economic explanation. And I'll tell you right now that, you know, the right answer is probably some combination of these things, you know, in terms of which was more important in Americans' decision to declare independence. But that's what we're going to be covering today. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to speak up. Okay, so why should we care? I kind of already covered that. What is going on in the picture here on the left-hand side of the screen? Anybody know? I can actually see the chat box today, so if you have any thoughts about it, you can put your...
Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, on the right side of the screen, we have the Boston Tea Party, certainly. And what's on the left?
Like waterboarding.
It does look like waterboarding.
What are they, tar and feather or something?
Yes, yes, yes. So a punishment that people used to pursue in this time period for somebody that they really wanted to humiliate was tarring and feathering them. They would be covered all over their body with tar and have feathers stuck on them. You could actually die from this treatment, but as we're going to see, stamp tax collectors were tarred and feathered in this period. So violence was not unknown among the American revolutionaries. Okay, so to give you a little run up to the time period that we're really going to be focusing on, which is after 1765, I want to tell you a little bit about British North Americans. I covered the various different colonies. We talked about the Chesapeake, we talked about New England, the Mid-Atlantic states, the South. But one of the things that British North Americans generally believed up until the start of the French and Indian War was that they lived in the best country in the world. And by the best country in the world, I mean Britain. They lived in the colonies of the most free country in the world, the country that had the greatest liberties for the subject. See, in 1688, there was what was called the Glorious Revolution in England, and the King, James II, was forced to leave, and he was replaced by William and Mary of the Netherlands with the stipulation that they agreed to be constitutional monarchs. So, to say this a different way, William and Mary were invited to be the joint rulers of England, but only if they would agree to a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights guaranteed to British people things like the right to trial by jury, the right to petition their government for redress of grievances, the right for Protestants to bear arms. It was a country that was not very tolerant of Catholicism at the time. But anyway, these rights of the English subject were believed by Americans to be the best rights, the most ample rights that anybody on the globe could have. So they were psyched to be part of Great Britain. In addition, Britain was the most economically powerful country in the 1700s. The English economy was very vital, very vigorous, because Britain had established its own bank. It had a booming national debt that was funded by bonds bought by the people of England, which allowed it to expand militarily and economically. English culture at the time was some of the most exciting in the world in terms of its writing, its music, its art. And British North Americans were like super psyched to be part of this extremely global power. They were also united by Protestantism, because during the 1700s, the main enmity that the British had was with France, and France was a Catholic country. And as I said to you a moment ago, the British were not super tolerant of Catholicism. So part of the national identity of people living in the British North American colonies was that they were Protestant, whether they belonged to the Church of England or they were Methodist or Presbyterian, whatever, they were all Protestant. Okay, so people were drawing closer to Britain before war broke out in the Ohio Valley of North America. War broke out in North America in 1854, and this French and Indian War, as it's called, or the 7 Years' War, would last until 1763 and really became a global conflict. The British and the French fought in various different areas of the world. They fought in India, they fought in what is today Canada, they fought in the Ohio Valley, they fought on the seas. Ultimately, the British won the 7 Years' War, including being able to take away what is today Canada from the French. But it was an extremely expensive war. They were in a lot of national debt as a result when the war finally wrapped up. And they're going to want to collect money from the British North American colonies where the war started to be able to pay back some of that national debt. Okay, I know I just said a lot of stuff. Are there any questions? All right, I'll take that as a no. Let me make sure I didn't skip a slide. Okay, so this shows you the colonies, the 13 British North American colonies, right after the 7 Years' War had ended. And you'll notice that the 7 Years' War actually is listed as having lasted 9 years. That is because it didn't start in Europe until 2 years after it started in North America. And so the Europeans call it the 7 Years' War and the Americans call it the French and Indian War. Why did the Americans call it the French and Indian War? Well, the British were fighting against the French and some of their Native American allies in North America. So when the war was over in 1763, Parliament, which is the legislature that covers the entire British Empire at this time, made what was called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And what the Proclamation Line said was that settlers could not move west of that line. You can see here that the line is red on the map and that it cuts into parts of what are today New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Why did the Parliament create the Proclamation Line of 1763? They really wanted to make sure that no American settlers clashed with Native Americans. They didn't want to have to fight another war in North America about territory. And a lot of settlers resented this and moved to the west of the Proclamation Line anyway. So this is the beginning of some conflict between Britain and the British North American colonists. All right. Then a large number of events happened that I will go through one at a time. In order to try to raise some money from the colonies to pay back the debts that they had kind of incurred in the defense of the colonies, Britain laid on some legislation that taxed the colonies in various ways. So the first such act was the Sugar Act of 1764, by which colonists had to pay an external tax on sugar. Any sugar imported into the colonies was subject to an external tariff. That Sugar Act was not that big a deal from the perspective of the colonists, but the act that took place the following year in 1765 really freaked them out much more. This was the Stamp Act. What did the Stamp Act do? What do you guys know about the Stamp Act?
Put a tariff on stamps, right? I mean,
Well, sort of. It created a requirement that every piece of paper pretty much used in the colonies carry a stamp. And so in this way, it wasn't a tariff, it was a direct tax that people had to pay at the point of sale of, say, newspapers or legal documents or playing cards or, you know, contracts. They all had to have a government stamp on them. This brought it much closer to home than, let's say, a tariff that is only paid at the port. People really noticed that the Stamp Act, you know, impacted them personally. They got really bent out of shape because one of the British liberties was that taxation should be the free gift of the people to the government. This is an idea that goes all the way back to the 1620s and maybe even before. And so resentment on the part of the colonists who had not agreed to this led to persecution of Stamp Act tax collectors. They were tarred and feathered. At least one of them was killed by being shot. Colonists refused to buy the stamp, and they even made up little like fake stamps with a skull and crossbones on that were supposed to represent that they were boycotting the stamp or that they were refusing to pay the stamp. Americans argued that it was political slavery to be taxed if you were not represented. And so the phrase taxation without representation came to be, or no taxation without representation came to be deployed by the political powers that be in the colonies.
Dr. Bronstein?
Yes.
I'm a little confused. So what do you mean by representation? Like if they're, does that mean that the money's just not going back to them, or what do you mean?
This is a great question. What they meant was political representation. And I should explain that although the colonies all had their little local assemblies that made up, you know, rules for the governance of each individual colony, you know, kind of weighed in, the larger institution that made laws for the colonies and for Britain itself was Parliament. And there were no colonials in Parliament. The reason for this, I'll go more into this a little bit later in the lecture, was something called virtual representation. The theory was that every member of parliament represented every British subject. So even if, if you lived in Leicester and you represented Leicester, you were still representing the interests of people who lived in Boston or people who lived in South Carolina. Now, what's the problem with saying, okay, well, this person from London or this person from Durham in the north of England or this person from, I don't know, just anywhere, any little village in Britain represents the interests of the people in the North American colonies?
There's definitely going to be bias for the place that they are coming from.
That's right. And they don't even know anything about what it's like to live in British North American colonies. They know nothing about the challenges that people faced, the kinds of difficulties that they encountered, the basis of their economy. So this is what they were anxious about, what the colonists were anxious about when they talked about no taxation without representation. They really thought Parliament was not a good body to legislate for them since they were not represented. Well, in 1766, because nobody was actually paying the stamp tax, Parliament decided to repeal it, but also put forth something called the Declaratory Act that said, all right, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but we still are the institution that makes the laws for you. So they were upholding their right to make legislation for the colonies. This was tantamount to the North Americans having won the battle over the Stamp Act, but lost the larger war about representation. And it still didn't solve the problem of how to get the colonists to pay for some of the debts that had been incurred on their behalf. So the finance minister, Charles Townshend, came up with a series of duties called the Townshend duties, because everybody's so original. And these are tariffs on certain items. So again, kind of trying to distance the payment of the tax from the individual colonists so that they wouldn't notice it so much. And they were on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. So at any time you were going to bring any of these things into the British North American colonies, a tariff would have to be paid on them. Colonists didn't like these tariffs. They didn't buy the official explanation that the mother country had the right to regulate trade with the colonies. They understood that Great Britain was really just trying to get money from the colonies. And so the assemblies in the colonies began to react by creating letters of opposition to these Townshend duties. The Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1768 sent out a circular letter denouncing the Townshend duties. And when I say a circular letter, I do not mean a letter on a round piece of paper, but rather that the letter circulated to various other North American colonies saying to them, let's boycott these things. Let's find some other way. Let's, instead of having tea imported from England by way, from China, but by way of England, let's make our own homegrown coffee out of parched corn. So this is the kind of thing that they were arguing for. Colonists began to boycott the goods in question. And in 1770, the Townshend duties were repealed because they really were not raising the money for the colonies that the British government had hoped that they would. The one duty that was left, the one tariff that was left, was on tea. Why did the British still want to collect a tax on tea? Well, it's pretty complicated, but suffice it to say that other parts of the British Empire depended on raising as much money from tea importation as possible. And let's also say the Americans were pretty addicted to the caffeine in tea at this point. There's an old cartoon that you guys probably are too young to have watched, Fairly Odd Parents, but the main character goes back in time, ends up at the time of the American Revolution, and everybody starts drinking tea and coffee, and this is what starts the Enlightenment and starts getting people in favor of declaring independence, is because they suddenly are caffeinated. That wasn't far wrong. You know, this is one of the things that really, really gets people talking to each other, is people hanging out in coffee houses and tea houses and talking about the duty that was laid on tea being brought into the colonies. Okay, questions so far? No? All right. I do believe, unless I am incorrect, that your homework assignment for this week has to do with Boston Massacre. And I should say the Boston Massacre took place on March 5th, 1770. I often ask, to what extent do you think the killing of 5 people or 6 people constitutes a massacre? But I won't ask that question. I'll just tell you that the American colonists really ran with the propaganda of this particular shootout between British troops in Boston and individual young people. What happened that day in Boston was this. There was a lot of friction between British troops and the young people in Boston. Do you want the homework as an essay or just answer the question? Oh, I see there's a question that came in on chat. It is always fine to do the homework as an essay. It is also fine to just answer the questions, but if you just answer the questions, make sure you have a paragraph for each of the questions. And if you do the essay, make sure that you hit all the questions, because all the questions, like answered all the questions, is one of the spots on the rubric by which these are graded. Okay. So back to the Boston Massacre. Why were the troops and the teenagers and young people of Boston conflicting with each other? Well, first of all, people didn't like to have soldiers stationed in their town, kind of keeping an eye on them. It was clear that the soldiers were there to police them rather than to protect them. But they were also competing for jobs. You see, the soldiers were not paid very well, and so in their spare time, they were seeking side jobs, doing the same kind of work that American young people did. And so there was a lot of friction about the soldiers taking away the jobs of the Americans. So there was this like low-key guerrilla warfare sometimes going on between the troops and the young people. And it was no different on this March day. It was cold out. There was snow on the ground. The young people were making ice balls with rocks inside and throwing them at the British troops that were massed in Boston, just kind of standing around. At some point, someone gave the order to fire on the crowd. A number of young people who were unarmed, other than having these snowballs with rocks inside, were killed. And then there was a trial that I'm not going to talk about because I believe it's part of your homework assignment. Anyway, this was considered to be one of the first sheddings of blood of the American Revolution. Oops. Okay, so questions about any of that? All right, the last thing on here is the destruction of the tea, otherwise known as the Boston Tea Party. It was not actually called the Boston Tea Party until the 1830s. It was called the destruction of the tea, which is why I've got it labeled the destruction of the tea. The Americans had to pay a tax on tea. The British wanted them to pay this tax. The Americans didn't want to. They were refusing to allow tea to be imported into the port of Boston. The governor, who was appointed by the king, the governor of Massachusetts, was trying to force the colonists to accept tea into the customs house so that tariffs could be paid. And the Americans decided that they didn't want to do this, so instead they were going to destroy the tea. Some of them dressed up as their version of Native Americans. They went out into the harbor. They went on board these ships where the tea was. They threw the tea into the harbor, and then they went around in little boats and they hit the tea boxes with their oars so that it would be thoroughly ruined, so that it would be thoroughly soaked with water and unusable. Why did they dress up as Native Americans? A couple of different reasons. First of all, they were trying to disguise their identities. And it's been argued that, you know, they didn't have a lot of choices in terms of costumes to dress up in. Some people who were engaging in social protests in this time dressed up in women's clothes and their wives' clothes. This happened in England in what were called the Rebecca riots, but these particular guys just decided to garb themselves as their version of Native Americans. Okay.
Did disguising themselves as Native Americans really have any benefit to throwing the blame on Native Americans, or did the English still realize it was the colonists?
Oh, everybody knew it was the colonists. It has, the one thing it's been good for is having historians say things like, well, the colonists were trying to show that they were in a state of nature, like the Native Americans, that they were a pre-political group that had broken away from the polity. And I don't know that I buy any of that. Like I say, it's easier, given the clothing that they had, to dress up as their version of Native Americans. But people knew that it was the Sons of Liberty, this group of radicals in Boston that had gotten their act together to go do the destruction of the tea. It was not really a secret to anybody. That's a good question. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question about the Boston Massacre, actually. So I don't know. I thought that what I've learned in the past is that it was something like some of the soldiers heard the command to fire, or someone fired a shot or something, and all the soldiers got scared and started firing. I wasn't sure exactly what caused the shooting to start.
In the trial, it came out that somebody apparently said fire, and that the soldiers thought that they had heard a command that they should fire. The captain of that particular regiment, Thomas Preston, was brought to trial. Samuel Adams, who is actually, or John Adams, whose relative Samuel was part of the Sons of Liberty, was the lawyer for the captain who was being tried. And it came out that he hadn't actually given the command to fire. So, you know, it might have been an accident, but nonetheless, it did end up with bloodshed on the part of the British against the North Americans.
Right. Oh, okay.
In the game Assassin's Creed, someone screamed fire and fired a shot to the air.
I love that game.
Assassin's Creed is just a game, that Assassin's Creed 3, but it's still pretty cool for like getting to walk around in revolutionary America. I have not played it myself, but when it first came out, my son was really into it, so I got to see a bunch of things from American history kind of play out in the game. If you're looking for a good way to study the American Revolution and you want to, play some Assassin's Creed 3, I don't think it's a bad idea.
It is a lot of fun to walk around, and it does. I mean, it puts you in the middle of the historical events. So all the games do, but in different time periods.
Indeed. Any other questions? All right, well, the British government got super mad that their tea had been destroyed, and so they responded with a series of punitive measures that are sometimes called the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed Boston to all commerce until they would pay for the tea that they had destroyed. And of course, the Bostonians refused to pay for the tea, but Boston is a harbor city, and so it was really just cutting off food supplies to Massachusetts. And other colonies responded by supplying the colonists over land with everything that they needed. So this is one of the things that drew the colonists from various different colonies together, was the need to kind of save Boston. The Massachusetts Government Act made it so that the assembly, the lower house of the Massachusetts government, was disbanded, and the council, the upper house, would be chosen by the crown. So Parliament had the final say over Massachusetts local government. The Administration of Justice Act said that now if a British soldier committed a crime in the colonies, instead of being tried in the colonies, that British soldier would be tried in actual mainland England. The colonists called this the Murdering Act because they felt like it excused major crimes by the soldiers, that soldiers could act with impunity in the colonies and then would be forgiven by juries in their own country. The Quartering Act said that British soldiers could be stationed in American homes. You couldn't say that you didn't want British troops to be in your house. They could say, okay, you get out and go live in the barn. And then you had to do that. And then finally, what pissed them off the most was the Quebec Act, which extended civil rights to French Catholics in what is now Canada, and extended the borders of Canada southward. Now remember, the English had this like really strong identification with Protestantism, and the North American colonists felt as though their rights were being taken away, and at the same time, rights were being given to a group that they hated, the Catholics, on their own borders. So these acts caused not only Massachusetts, but also other states to respond. And in 1774, a Continental Congress was called. The Congress said, a lot of these things that Britain has been doing are not, don't fit in with our safety as British North Americans, and so we need to come up with our own government that is going to protect us. Okay. Questions so far? All right, so one of the three interpretations of how did Americans get politicized enough to revolt is the sort of chronological, here's a list of things that happened. Mostly the British government did things and the Americans responded. So the political explanation is one of three explanations. A second explanation is what we might call an ideological explanation, or to put it in different words, Americans' thoughts about their government were changing and their political ideas were changing, and that was the most important thing. So in this particular interpretation of how the shift happened, we have to consider the structure of government. As I said to you, there were no representatives to Parliament from British North America. The British government has three branches. It has an elected branch called the House of Commons, but only few people could actually vote for what are called members of Parliament. You had to have a certain amount of property. You had to live in a represented area. Some of the largest cities in England had no representatives to Parliament. And the House of Commons is kind of like our House of Representatives in that they inaugurated the legislation. Then there was the House of Lords, which was an aristocratic house composed of aristocrats, hereditary aristocrats, who had inherited their title from their fathers. So only, suffice it to say, only men in any of these positions. And also bishops of the Church of England were in the House of Lords. The House of Lords was another body that had to sign off on all legislation. And then finally, if both houses of Parliament agreed to a piece of legislation, the king would sign off on it, and that was how legislation would happen. As you can see, again, no colonials represented in this at all. The king, in his government, had this thing called the Board of Trade. The Board of Trade was like the cabinet office responsible for dealing with the colonies. And for a long time, the Board of Trade had followed this policy called salutary neglect, where they really let the American assemblies, their little local governments, make a lot of decisions for themselves. But starting with the French and Indian War, they cracked down a lot more on the activities of these assemblies. And then you had the problem of virtual representation, where people, it was argued, were being represented by all of the MPs in Parliament, but they actually didn't have any representation in Parliament. At the same time that all this was happening, there started to be, in the late 1600s and throughout the 1700s, a critique of the monarchy by one of the two political groupings in Britain called the Whigs. Whigs and Tories, basically the two political parties at the time. And the Whigs argued that monarchy was corrupt, that there was too much stuff going on, like the king and his ministers would give people salaried positions, and in return for receiving those salaries, they would do the king's bidding in corrupt ways. That people were not pursuing government service for the benefit of the people, but rather just for the enrichment of their own pockets. These Whig critiques of government were very popular in British North America, and pamphlets started to come over from Britain, and they were quoted in the newspapers that circulated in British North America, and they were read aloud in the coffee houses and tea houses in American cities, because there was something called the public sphere growing. There was increasingly a place where colonial people could discuss what was going on in politics, where they could debate, where they could hang out. Without a public sphere of some kind, there really couldn't be a social movement that was formed, because people would have no way to communicate with each other. Can you think of anything that constitutes the public sphere today? What does the public sphere look like today, do you think?
The internet?
Yeah, I was about to say Facebook.
I agree. I think we now have kind of a virtual public sphere, because entities like the internet or Instagram or Twitter kind of unite people with common interests, distribute news, call people into action. So we have a virtual public sphere. They had a physical public sphere. And it was important for getting people on the same page about what they wanted to see in terms of their government. Okay, questions, comments? All right, the final explanation was that there was an economic shift, that because so much of what the British were imposing on the British North American colonies was in the form of taxation, British North Americans were brought together by their common effort in breaking away from belonging to that economic circle that Britain was part of. The circular letters that were being produced by the various assemblies, the fact that colonies were working together to relieve Boston when it was cut off from being able to be supplied by virtue of the harbor, the boycotts that people were engaged in, the home production of textiles and other goods that, you know, people were making their own stuff instead of buying British items because they felt there was a certain patriotism in making homespun goods and showing that indeed they were not actually patronizing the British. And the thing about an economic kind of joining together against the British was that it brought in groups that were traditionally underrepresented, like women. Women were not really thought to have the mental capacity to participate in politics. In the 18th century, they were, I'm going to talk about this more in a subsequent lecture, but they were thought to be too emotional for political participation and not sufficiently intellectual. But they were the ones in charge of doing the purchasing for their households. And so this brought them into the field of politics by, you know, giving them a reason to belong to the nascent American revolutionary spirit / movement. Okay. So all of these play a role to a certain extent. On the right there, you see a large loom, hand loom weaving in the home. The wearing and making of homespun was a good sort of public announcement of the fact that you were boycotting British in this time period. And again, not drinking the tea that was brought in from China by the British East India Company was another way of boycotting the British in this time period. So altogether, the political, the cultural, and the economic shifts helped to make Americans kind of take up arms against their duly constituted government. And as you can see from today, not all of that was rational, reasonable, nonviolent activity that was undertaken. They definitely destroyed some stuff. Okay. So what I want to